Generation 4's Battle Hall should be way more popular than it actually is. With 477 Pokemon to choose from in both singles and doubles formats, there is close to endless content here, and the facility is quite similar to the currently popular Ironmon challenge. However, the Battle Hall is also fundamentally broken, but in a rather interesting way. This is a long and storied history of the facility, and has taken me almost 6 months to solve. I will present the mystery fairly, but unlike in the arcade video, I do not expect any viewer to be able to guess this. Instead, I want to share how weird and confusing this entire saga has been. The Battle Hall is a single Pokemon challenge where you must aim to build a win streak. When you enter, you can select a type to face, and these types have ranks. Every time you beat a type, the rank goes up. A higher rank means a stronger Pokemon and a higher level Pokemon. This may sound simple, but there is actually quite a lot of strategy involved, as you can use different moves or items or even completely different Pokemon for different types. An extreme version of this is to have 17 different versions of a Pokemon, one for each type you will face in the Battle Hall. An example of this is Tsitso, who got 170 wins with his army of 17 Pikachu. Indeed, there is a small community that has built itself around getting 170 wins with the worst Pokemon possible. However, if you just want to play normally, then a Pokemon such as Raikou or Garchomp can get to 170 quite easily, 170 being the gold symbol. After 170 wins, you face the Hall's endgame, where the type remains at rank 10 and you must cycle through all types until you eventually lose. Doubles work similarly, except everything is just a bit more complicated, and there are a few more options available to the user. The most important question for a Hall player is a simple one. What enemies can appear and when do they appear? It turns out there's an enemy Hall set for all 477 legal opponents in the game. We've known about this for almost the entire lifespan of the game. If the Hall was boring and if Game Freak was good at coding, the story would end here. It would be interesting to see the optimal solutions for all different Pokemon in singles and doubles in the Hall, but it would largely just be an exercise in building around certain larger threats. Well, as it turns out, a lot of Hall players have reported the same thing consistently. It seems like some Pokemon are very common in the Hall, and some Pokemon are very rare. When I first heard this, my immediate reaction was that it was probably nothing. People make up patterns all the time when there's a low sample size. I did a bit of research and didn't find much. A few users had tracked their own findings and data points in spreadsheets, but it was only really Atsync's datasheet that seemed to suggest anything was seriously wrong. Unfortunately, Generation 4 runs quite slowly on an emulator, and this kind of data collection is boring, which means it's often unreliable for a human to do it. So one evening I decided to code a bot. It would play the Hall for over a week, collecting over 20,000 data points, and automatically recording a note of all the enemies it saw for different types and ranks. I ran this in both singles and doubles for multiple Pokemon. As a joke, I also added a legitimate Raikou one, and the bot got the second highest win streak ever. This is of course a complete fluke, but it did make me laugh. The results are actually shocking. There is indeed an odd pattern going on. I'm going to display the relative results per type now. It's definitely not uniformly random, the players are right, but I also could not see any pattern when this popped up. I invite anyone to try and see their own pattern here. Some types seem significantly more broken than other types. A lot of semi-reasonable ideas came up. Perhaps higher base stat total Pokemon are very common. Perhaps dual types are rarer or more common. Nope, it was none of these. Normally if I let a problem stew, I come back to a solution within a few days, but not this time. In fact, even within the data collected things are weird. Why is Slowbro so common in water but only averagely common in Psychic? Steelix is the most common in both Steel and Ground, but Latios is less common than Latias. The code decomp for the Battle Hall is not yet complete, and so I initially said that it's probably fastest and most efficient to wait for the decomp to be complete so we can review the code directly. Well, after a few months of occasionally checking this on and off and getting nowhere, and wanting to know what the actual answer was, it was time to take a leaf out of the old Olympiad playbook. Difficult but solvable problems should be approached in a fast method. The most familiar problem to this is the way that Pokemon are generated in other facilities in the frontier. For a long time this was my leading theory of what was going on, and the opinion of most of the community. In other facilities, the class of the NPC trainer determines the rarity, so Ice types are a bit more common in the rest of Frontier because there is an Ice type trainer which can only have Ice type Pokemon. Does that apply here? No. Trainers have no deviation from the global appearance rates. So let's skip ahead to A and T. First, some undeniable truths. The dataset is not uniform. The dataset still managed to be somewhat random. By this, I mean that when you select Fire type, it's not as if Charizard always shows up. It does appear as if every Pokemon can be chosen. I confirmed on Platinum that the player's save file does not directly affect the results. Neither does the Pokemon that is currently being used by the player, and you can assume that the random number generator in Generation 4 is sufficiently random and not to blame. Let's also cover some basic reasonable assumptions. First, Game Freak probably did not intend for this to happen. They probably wanted it to be roughly uniformly random. and this is probably just a mistake. Second, the mistake is unlikely to be complex in nature. For example, it's unlikely they had some massive hidden table with rarities per type per Pokemon. And third, it's likely that, as with most programming errors, it's within our abilities to foresee the mistake and potentially reproduce it. The most important aspect of solving hard problems though is to solve a simpler version of the same problem first. So let's pretend that there are only 5 Pokemon in the whole game: Pikachu, Charizard, Blastoise, Venusaur and Rapidash. We seek a process that selects a fire type that fits with the patterns from earlier. This means we don't have a 50-50 to choose between the fire types, but we also don't have a process that will only select one of the fire types. There are 2 processes I would expect a programmer to use here. Firstly, pick a random Pokemon until you find a fire type, and secondly, go through the list, take all the fire types out, and then randomly select from that list. Both of these would be uniformly random, and so neither can be correct. A less experienced programmer might be concerned about the slowness of the above 2 processes. An example of a fast process could be to start at the beginning and go through the list until you find a fire type, but this would also be wrong, as it would mean that Charizard is always selected every single time. As one final clue, let's invent a familiar problem. How would you generate an even number from 1 to 100? The best way to do this is to generate a random number from 1 to 50 and then multiply it by 2. Also quite good would be to generate a random number from 1 to 100, check if it's even, and if it's not even, add 1. Considering this is what made me see the flaw in the Battle Hall. The process is this. Select a random Pokemon. Check if this Pokemon is the fire type. If it is not, then go to the next Pokemon in the list and check if that's fire type. Keep checking until you find a fire type. This creates a distribution where how common a Pokemon is within its type is directly proportional to how many Pokemon directly before it's in the sequence do not share that type. This explains why Latios is so much rarer than Latias. Latios comes directly after Latias in the sequence, and so if you're looking for a Psychic or a Dragon type, you will always stop on Latias before Latios. The only way to get Latios is to land directly on it at the start. It also explains why Slowbro is so common in water. It just so happens that there's a massive gap of non-water types before Slowbro in this sequence. Honestly, this algorithm would work okay if the Pokemon sequence was more random, but if you look at the sequence, it's quite clear that they added Pokemon in batches, and so evolution neighbours in Pokemon terms often get downgraded in terms of rarity. There is one final mystery that doesn't fit into this pattern, which is Regigigas. It's about 10 times rarer than it should be, but any developers can probably instantly spot the problem. Regigigas is the last Pokemon in the list. The process that should loop back to the beginning after reaching the end of the list probably just has an error in the end condition. This is fairly common, and it means that the only way Regigigas can be generated is if you land exactly on it, just like with Latios. Okay, so what does this actually mean for the Battle Hall? It's actually kind of massive. Up until now, players had planned Hall streaks, assuming that any Pokemon could appear in any type, but really there are quite a number of sets that can only appear with a 0.5% chance. And this surely means that the best way to plan for types, particularly for weaker Pokemon, is to specifically plan more for the more common Pokemon, and to look at the least common Pokemon and simply ignore them. The Hall is still very difficult to solve and optimise though, and I guess we'll have to see what comes of this in the future. I'm leaving the exact probabilities of facing each Pokemon in each type in the description. Remember that this has a few exceptions though. You can't see a Pokemon that you've already seen that round, and you can't see the Pokemon that you're already using, and this will slightly change the probabilities for some Pokemon. However, I am looking forward to see how much this changes Hall streaks going forward. And I would also say this is a great opportunity to have a record in the frontier. You can simply pick a Pokemon that no one has used before in doubles or singles, and do your best to go on a big streak with it. It's likely that you would automatically have the world record by doing this to a reasonable degree of effort. And finally, I want to say that I heard the feedback on the arcade video, and my next video will be a factory guide for beating the factory gold symbol. I'm trying to aim this at all skill levels. Until next time.